Welcome to Nasdaq Trade Talks, where we meet with the top thought leaders and strategists in emerging technologies, digital assets, the regulatory landscape, and capital markets. This segment is presented by Charles Schwab. I'm your host, Jill Malandrino, and joining us remotely, we have Congressman Pat Harrigan representing North Carolina's 10th District. And joining me on the desk at the Nasdaq market site, we have Mike McNerney, Chief Risk and Security Officer at Arkenstone Defense. We're here to discuss safeguarding the digital economy through policy, engineering, and AI. It is great to have the both of you with us. Thank you both for your service as well. Congressman, we'll kick it off with you. Let's talk about the current environment, the state of cyber threats, not just as it relates to national defense, but this impacts critical infrastructure such as energy, grids, and so forth. Give us some background.
Well, there's no question that the threats that we face today are unprecedented, right? We live in an era of very high technology. We also happen to live in an era because of that technology and the proliferation of that technology, very inexpensive technology that's incredibly capable, where we're kind of in a situation where there's not a whole lot that we can do to our adversaries that our adversaries cannot do to us. And so we're almost in this new era of mutually assured destruction from a cybersecurity space. And what that does is it changes the dynamics of the safety and security and confidence in our market economies, right? As well as the second and third order impacts that it has on our nation's defense. And so we're in a very complex, complicated environment. And at the end of the day, this is one of the reasons that I asked to sit on both the House Armed Services Committee and the Science, Space, and Technology Committees, because while one deals with our nation's defense, the other deals with the next generation of what's going to drive our market economy. Those two things are really the same in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and Mike, we were talking about that off camera before, where it's not just traditional warfare, but financial services are critical infrastructure. The grids, imagine if you have something like an exchange go down. It's a global impact.
That's right, Jill, and I think it's important to build off the Congressman's comments a little bit. We do appear to be entering this era of kind of renewed great power conflict, particularly against nations like China and Russia. I think one of the reasons why we're hearing so much about this push for adoption in AI and the AI race, as well as raising our cybersecurity standards, is because we're feeling that competition. In fact, military planners will tell you that they increasingly believe that it is possible we will be in a confrontation with the People's Liberation Army over Taiwan within the next 5 years. And so that's driving really quite a bit of this. And I think, while this is something we would hopefully avoid, if a military confrontation is unavoidable, then we certainly do want to win. And to win that, we're going to have to win on technology, and we're going to have to win on security. And I think that's driving a lot of this, as the Congressman was mentioning.
Yeah, and Congressman, what is Congress doing now to harden the grid and research networks, and how those measures are going to scale to utilities, to ports, to hospitals, and other critical infrastructure?
Yeah, it's a lot to cover. I'd point you to HR 4942, which I'm an original co-sponsor of, that is actually the Quantum Encryption Readiness and Resiliency Act. And look, this is going to establish public-private partnerships that get after this problem in a very real way. I think from the perspective of when we have quantum computing actually come on board, quantum cryptography is something that the world has not had to deal with, but you've got to understand that the race for quantum is really everything, right? We've got energy race going on. We've got artificial intelligence race. We also have a quantum race, because if you think about quantum in its current or future, very near future capacity, it's going to break through anything that our NSA is trying to protect right now. The greatest and most significant secrets that we have in our nation, we won't be able to defend against that. That's why we've got to lead in the space of quantum computing. We are doing that right now, but we've got to make sure that we've got the conditions set and are making the necessary investments to make sure that we dominate quantum computing in America.
Yeah, and that's part of the challenge. When you're playing 4D, 5D chess here, everyone's leveraging, whether it's good actors, bad actors, the same types of technology. So it's always a race to try and stay ahead.
I think that's right. I think one of the other dynamics that is both a strength and sometimes a challenge for us in the United States is much of our critical infrastructure and a great deal of our innovation is coming from the private sector. It doesn't really come from government. And so we need to put together regimes where we can let companies innovate, but also protect them from nation-state adversaries that are better resourced and determined to steal that information and use it for their own advantage, which is why I'm glad that people like the Congressman are thinking so clearly and forwardly about these kinds of things.
So it's public-private partnerships.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, well, I mean, you need, the public sector, of course, for scale and support. You can't, just go in and take over grids or utilities or ports. I mean, and you need to work together.
Yeah, that's right. And you don't want to stifle the innovation or the speed either, right? Like there are two ways that we essentially lose a future conflict. One is we don't innovate fast enough, and the other is we let all of our secrets go out the back door, and we have to do both, and that does require both government and private sector doing their parts.
Right. Congressman, what are some lessons that can be learned from North Carolina's 10th district, the one that you represent? What can be learned from the manufacturing base there?
Well, look, I think one of the things that we did this year, which was kind of leading in on some of the threats that our adversaries pose to our national security with respect to purchasing land outside of our military installations and using those for purposes that are very much averse our national interests, is we actually dug in and we found a company that was actually operating on our military bases that was owned by the Chinese Communist Party. That's actually what spurred us to file the Military Installation Retail Security Act of 2025. We want the Department of Defense, now the Department of War, to undergo a very broad investigation into every single military contractor that is operating in and around our military facilities. And we want to make sure that they're not owned by an adversarial nation. That just opens up our country to a whole host of vulnerabilities that just don't need to be there. Certainly, we want to be supportive of the private sector, and we believe that in the private sector, you can sell your company to whoever you want to. But I also don't believe, and I don't think many Americans believe, that you should be able to sell your company to the Chinese Communist Party or one of our other very clear adversaries and still operate on our military installations. That seems like it's a bridge too far.
Yeah, oh, it certainly is. And Congressman, I would also like to include in the public-private partnership academics as well. I mean, these are the breeding grounds for the incubators that are developing these types of technologies. I think it can't be understated just how important it is to also partner with academia in that respect as well.
No question.
Yeah. AI, though, in the same token, can be used to mitigate and predict some of these vulnerabilities that we have. So there is some good as it relates to how we can either train and figure out where these gaps and exposures are as well. Because I would imagine it's a challenge. You know, basic training is something different than trying to prepare for an enemy that you can't necessarily see or even know where they are.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. There is no reason why AI can't be transformative in the positive for all of us. There are challenges that we have to overcome, but you're already seeing great cybersecurity companies, for example, using AI and other forms of automation to close the gaps when it comes to our cyber defenses. There's no reason why that can't continue and why we can't even, leapfrog and get an advantage from that. In the battlefield sense, it is also imperative for us to leverage AI to gain a battlefield advantage. One of the things that we've seen, for example, in the war in Ukraine, is a lot of traditional ways of doing war, like with battleships and tanks, kind of don't really work anymore because of advanced technologies, including automation, UAVs, and whatnot. And so we do have to move forward with those as well. So there's an offense and there's also a defense.
Yeah, and also, Congressman, when you think about the guardrails when it comes to procurement and de-risking some of this adoption across critical infrastructure and not operating in silos, right? That's also part of the challenge, but being able to establish these guardrails so we don't run the risk of inadvertently exposing vulnerabilities.
Yeah, there's no question about it. Look, I think one of the greatest threats that we have is ourselves, right? I mean, I can speak from the government's perspective. We're in the way all too often. Mike said it earlier, the innovation is going to come from the private sector. We actually have all of the tools that we need to solve the problems that we face moving forward over the next decade. The government does have to unify those, though, and that does cost a lot of money. That becomes very difficult when we're almost $38 trillion in debt. We're running a $2.2 trillion a year annual deficit. And a big part of our defense industrial base is centered around very exquisite, very expensive, very capable technologies. But in an era where our adversaries are able to take very ubiquitously available, very inexpensive technologies that are highly capable, even if they have only 60% of the capability that we have, if they can manufacture that in mass, they can end up winning the economics of war because they overwhelm our very expensive and very exquisite technologies. We need to be very, very careful about winning the economics of war because right now we're very upside down with respect to our nation's defense.
Is it right if I interject? So as I mentioned earlier, I've been elevated to honorary co-anchor for today. So I'd love to ask you, Congressman, a follow-up question on that. I think you're making like two really, really interesting points. The second one I'd love to explore is, we have this really rise, this kind of explosion, forgive the pun, of defense tech companies that are really stepping forward into this effort. But it strikes me that doing business with the government is still a challenge for a great many of them. Do you see that? I mean, you represent a military and defense-focused community. Do you see that challenge, and what are the kinds of things that we can do to not only develop technologies, but speed their acquisition into the department so that they are in the warfighter's hands as quickly as possible?
Look, not only do I see that challenge, I've experienced it myself. I started my company in a double-wide trailer outside of Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and we've now got 120,000 square foot of manufacturing. I bid off on something the government asked me to do back in 2017, where myself and a handful of investors invested about 10 million to do something that our government asked us to do, and then they continued to buy what we were manufacturing from Russia and China. It was one of the most frustrating things in the world, and so I understand the challenges that exist to small businesses to doing business with our government. The other problem that exists is that our government is a terrible customer. Because we budget on annual budgetary timelines, the government cannot forecast a demand that is reasonable with respect to what the market economy expects. And that causes a lot of friction and frustration of, okay, do we have the chicken or the egg scenario here? If you lean forward and you do this, is there going to be that return on that investment on the back end? And the government, in many instances, cannot guarantee that. That's why we have such a problem with respect to, the 6 largest defense contractors that we have that are operating on cost plus, because we've got to get through this problem. But it's a very complicated problem set. There's some really good people working on it right now. And I do think it's something we have to knock down if we are going to provide opportunities to all levels of innovators, because it's not just the big multi-billion-dollar companies that can bring advances to the table. It's often the small guys that are in their garage that can change the trajectory of our market economy and the nation's defense.
Mike, what about balancing the need between security and compliance?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to make sure that we are setting security regimes and protocols that are, about enhancing security, not just necessarily about checking the box. Mm-hmm. As I think we can see from this conversation, it is going to be really, really important for us to secure these technologies. It is a clear strategy of our adversaries to take our IP. We know that. That is how they try to gain an advantage against us, because they know we are more innovative than they are. So securing these companies is going to be critical. One critical thing I would encourage anyone who is thinking about doing business with the government right now is a rule that just came out called the Cyber Maturity Model Certification, or CMMC. This is going to essentially be a requirement if you want to do business with the Department of Defense or the Department of War, that you have to meet an elevated cybersecurity standard. It is going to be painful. You should be getting ahead of that. But the reason why that's out there is to try to keep some of this critical information that is in the hands of our industrial base from falling into our adversaries' hands.
Yeah, well, I mean, to your point, you can't just check the boxes.
Right.
It's not going to be enough.
That's right. Yeah. That's right. Yeah, I think, and I'm encouraged about this particular rule. Too often, I think government regulations are about checking the boxes,
right,
and there is a distinction between compliance and security. And I hope that we are, with this erring on the side of more security and less box checking.
Yeah, I mean, Congressman, at the end of the day, do we have the ability to execute on this in a reasonable time frame, and also be able to adapt with the rapidity of how quickly technology is advancing? I mean, Moore's Law is almost out the window at this point.
Yeah, it's long out the window. I mean, we're iterating much faster than the old 18-month timeline, right? Look, I think the answer is yes, we absolutely have the capability if we can get government out of the way of the private sector. This is something that we're working with the Army right now. I'm very good friends with the Secretary of the Army and the Chief of Staff of the Army, and they're just absolutely pulling their hair out because, we're falling behind in our procurement processes. We are really purchasing yesterday's technology with tomorrow's dollars that, oh, by the way, we don't have because we're running deficits, right? We have to completely upend that regime. And the way that we have to do it is actually by less governmental red tape. We have to actually assume a little bit more risk and have less governmental oversight on the processes that we are going to use to change the future of our nation's defense. And we have to allow for confidence in the people that work in the Department of War, that work in our research universities, that work in our national laboratories, to allow them to go out and do some really great things. They're going to make some mistakes along the way, but overall, we've got to take the leash off, or we're going to get outpaced by our adversaries.
All right. Appreciate both of your insights. Thanks for joining us on Trade Talks. And thanks for joining me from MarketSite. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq.